Okay, so welcome to the deep dive. And today we're going to look into something that I think a lot of people have probably wondered about, which is like, what is it actually like to try to get a white-collar job in Norway if you're a foreigner?
Yeah.
And we have some really fascinating stuff to dig into. We have this very, very honest personal account. We've got some more like practical guidance on the Norwegian job market. We have people chiming in on a forum who have either gone through similar things or are going through it now. We even have like a mini guide to like how to work in Norway.
Yeah, a good mix of sources there to get, the on the ground and the kind of like bird's eye view.
Yeah.
So yeah, it'll be good to like get into those nuances.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to jump right in with this this piece that I thought was really, really interesting. It's called "No Way in Norway: The Ongoing Frustrations of a Foreign Job Seeker." It appeared on Life in Norway, and it's written by a British professional. And this is important context. He's got a good business degree, has these impressive qualifications in financial services. He's worked for major international firms. He made the move to Norway. He puts in the effort. He learns Norwegian. He gets to this certified B1, B2 level. And he's been trying now in the Norwegian job market for 3 years.
Wow.
So like
over 1,000 applications he submitted.
Yeah.
That just really speaks to the extent of, just the difficulty.
Yeah, it really does. And this is what I thought was so interesting is that despite this really good background and even his efforts to learn Norwegian, which, B1, B2 is no joke, it's a real achievement. And seemingly this genuine desire to integrate, it's been much harder than he, and I'm sure a lot of other people, would have predicted to find a suitable, like, white-collar job. So it really, I think, sets the stage for, like, this deep dive into this topic.
It definitely does. So, let's get into it. I guess the first thing is, this thing that always comes up when we talk about moving to a new country, which is the language barrier.
Yeah.
So what was his experience with that?
Well, so, as we said, he learned Norwegian. He got to this B1, B2 level. And, he even mentions that it's certified by Competence Norge, which I guess for people who aren't familiar, that's like the national body that's in charge of language training and assessment for adult immigrants. And he even said that, the Folkeuniversitet, which is where he studied, they kind of suggested that, oh yeah, this level will be a real advantage for you. But the surprising reality is it wasn't really enough for these office jobs that he was looking for.
Right. It's that distinction. It's like, yeah, okay, so you have conversational Norwegian, which is very useful for day-to-day life.
Right.
But the expectations, at least in what we see here, from the employers looking for these office jobs goes way beyond that.
Right.
And often they'll explicitly state that like they need like a C1 level of fluency, right, in Norwegian and English. And I think, like for context, B1, B2, C1, this is referring to the common European framework of reference for languages, where, C1 indicates like a much higher level of fluency, closer to like native speaker proficiency.
Right. Yeah, it almost feels like if you're learning Norwegian specifically for work, that total fluency, or very, very close to it, is like the unspoken or sometimes very clearly spoken requirement. Like he even makes this funny point where he's like, being able to have a basic chat at the supermarket isn't exactly gonna, unlock these like job opportunities.
Right. And that makes you wonder, for someone listening, if you're thinking about working in Norway, and you're like, okay, I'm going to learn the language. Well, like, what is your target level going to be, right? Because that's a big investment of time and energy.
Yeah.
And it seems like if you're not going for, like, that near-native fluency, your options are going to be much more limited if you're trying to get into these, like, professional white-collar type jobs. I wonder what drives that expectation. Is it, the nature of the work being so collaborative? Is it like the way things are communicated, the kind of like nuances and the expectations for being so precise, especially in a country that's fairly like linguistically homogenous.
Right.
Misunderstandings can have much bigger impacts, especially in smaller teams.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's move on to another big hurdle he ran into, which was the often very slow pace of these recruitment processes.
Right.
In Norway.
Yeah.
He's got some great personal anecdotes about this.
Yeah, he does.
Where he talks about these like these journeys that dragged on for like 8 months and being ghosted at very, very late stages or even being rejected like months after a face-to-face interview,
Oh, wow.
often due to these like phantom budget cuts, which,
Right.
who knows?
Ironic.
Yeah, and this ties into something that he kind of picked up, especially from people, in the public sector, which is this phrase "ting tar tid," which means things take time.
Hmm.
And it really seems to reflect this like broader kind of acceptance of a slower pace in many, many processes, which, when you're actively trying to find a job and support yourself, that can be incredibly frustrating.
Yeah. So just be prepared for some very long application timelines potentially. It might be a very different pace than what you're
Yeah.
used to, depending on where you come from.
Yeah.
Patience
Yeah.
seems to be a real virtue in this context.
Yeah.
And it does make you wonder, like, what underpins that?
Yeah.
Is it like more bureaucratic processes within the companies? Is it like more more thoroughness, or is it just like a smaller talent pool and they're just taking longer to find the quote unquote perfect person?
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Another big, big challenge was the apparent just lack of advertised white collar roles that even matched his skills. And that's kind of surprising given that, Norway has a generally pretty good economy.
Yeah. Yeah.
But he said that despite like searching every single day on LinkedIn, Fin.no, and Indeed, which are like the big platforms, he often found zero relevant jobs.
Yeah. So maybe those online job boards aren't really telling the full story,
Yeah.
like what's really out there.
Right, right. So this really highlights, looking at some alternative like job hunting strategies,
Yeah.
like directly approaching companies that you're interested in working for,
Yeah.
even if they're not advertising. And also he mentioned a lot about networks, like really using your professional and personal networks.
Mhm.
He specifically called out like the perceived value of university networks in Norway, like the alumni network of BI Norwegian Business School,
Okay.
especially for finance. He mentioned BI a lot. I wonder if it's just like a really active alumni network
Yeah.
or if companies just really like to recruit from there
Right.
for whatever reason.
Yeah.
But it was very interesting how often that came up. So this was actually really surprising. He said that he often got more positive responses and even interviews when he applied for remote positions with like international companies
Okay.
than he did when he applied for similar roles within Norway itself. So I think like the takeaway for our listener here is don't just rely on like the typical job boards. Really think about like cold emailing companies you're interested in,
Yeah.
and really understand the value that these alumni networks seem to have from these Norwegian institutions.
Okay. And speaking of the advertised roles,
Yeah.
he noticed something kind of discouraging about the ones that did appear.
Yeah, this was really striking, I thought. He kept seeing the exact same jobs advertised again and again
Wow.
and again for months,
Wow.
which suggests to me that like these companies are just so incredibly picky
Right.
that they'd rather just like keep looking
Yeah.
and looking
Yeah, look.
and looking for that absolutely perfect candidate rather than just filling the role.
Right.
Yeah.
They're really holding out for that, unicorn candidate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So the implication here is that, like, unless you are that very, very precise fit for what they're looking for, it might not be a very fast process.
Right. So the sense of urgency might be very different.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, let's dive into something that can be really challenging for newcomers to any country, which is, the dreaded bureaucracy. And he had some interesting experiences to share about this.
Yeah. Yeah. Dealing with government institutions. Always
Yeah.
a fun one.
Oh, yeah.
So like, what was his experience with this?
So a big hurdle was actually when he was dealing with NAV, which is the Norwegian Labor and Welfare Administration. And a big initial problem was just the requirement for bank aid. So, Bankies, for people who aren't familiar, this is like this form of like secure electronic ID
Right.
that you need for all kinds of online services in Norway. And apparently it's really, really hard for foreigners to get.
I see.
And he specifically mentions that like UK nationals post-Brexit have had it even harder.
Right.
So, and then he talks about these processes that just seem illogical.
Right.
You have to declare a permanent move to Norway before you can even access like job seeker resources
Right.
from NA. Even though he was already living and working in Norway,
I see it.
just in these temporary roles. And this was great advice that he had. If you're going to go to any government office, bring a native Norwegian speaker with you.
Oh, yeah, that's a good tip.
It always helps.
Yeah. It can really help to just make things smoother and avoid like, misunderstandings or
That
whatever.
right. Right. It might just speed things up.
Right.
So, I mean, the big takeaway here is, yeah, just be prepared. You're going to have to deal with like some complex administrative stuff, with government agencies
Right.
and yeah, and really try to understand the role of Banky because it seems like that's pretty crucial to access, all sorts of services. So, yeah, get that sorted early, even if it is a bit of a pain.
Exactly. So, okay, so we talked a little bit before about networking. Let's get into this a little bit more and
Yeah.
like the importance of it, but also maybe some of the limitations of it that he talks about in the Norwegian job market. Yeah. Because I remember like the general advice you always hear is like network, network, network. So, is it a bit different in Norway?
It seems like it might be. So he points out that, like, yes, in general, like, networks matter, but it seems to be, like, very particular kinds of networks in Norway.
Okay.
Like, he had this experience with a specific company where it seemed like they basically only hired graduates from BI.
Wow.
So it seems like in some cases, these really prestigious institutions, especially BI for finance, just like having that degree holds so much weight.
Yeah. So, yeah, if you're in those fields,
Yeah.
definitely
Yeah.
try to get into BI.
Right,
Yeah.
right. And the other interesting thing he said was that, like, personal networks, like outside of these established alumni networks, might be less impactful than you would see in other countries,
Hmm.
where your network is kind of more like, general professional contacts that can help you.
Correct, correct.
Um, but in Norway, it really seems like there's this focus on like these formal educational ties.
I see, I see. And they trust these big institutions. Like they have
Yeah.
like a high like perceived quality of the people that they produce.
Right, right. So building your network is obviously always a good idea, but I think it's good for people to understand that like there's a hierarchy, there's like an emphasis
Yeah.
on certain types of
Okay.
connections.
So let's talk about your actual like, work experience and your qualifications,
Yeah.
right? And how those like translate if you're coming from abroad
Yeah.
into
Yeah.
like the Norwegian job market. What did he say about this?
So this is, he had some really interesting reflections on this. Basically, what he realized is that even if you have really good experience at a well-known company,
Yeah.
it doesn't always translate in terms of perceived value.
Okay.
If that specific knowledge, like the product knowledge or the market you understand, is not really relevant to the Norwegian market,
Right.
like he gave an example of like UK specific financial products, like, ISAs and personal pensions,
Yeah.
which don't exist in the same way in Norway.
Yeah.
So his expertise in that was kind of useless to a Norwegian company.
Yeah. So it really underscores the importance of like critically looking at your skills
Yeah.
and your
Yeah.
experience and like assessing like, is this really going to translate to Norway?
Yeah.
Like, is my experience actually going to be like, going to make sense in this context? Or is it something that I like need to almost relearn or readapt?
Yeah. And I think like the key takeaway here is like it's really good to do this like honest self-assessment
Yeah.
before you move
Right.
and think about like how does my background really align with like the specific needs and company culture in Norway?
Right, yeah.
Because just because something is impressive, internationally doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be so valuable in the Norwegian context.
Yeah. It's like you got to really tailor your approach to where you're going.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just stepping back a little bit,
Yeah.
to provide some broader context here. Like, what are the key industries that we're looking at in Norway?
Yeah, so I mean, he points out correctly that like okay, Norway is like, it's the oil and gas sector is
Right.
huge. And so
Okay.
if you have like the right experience, education or technical skills in that area, obviously your opportunities are going to be much much greater,
Right. Right.
than other areas. He also, I thought, correctly pointed out that like Norway has this huge public sector,
Right.
which accounts for a massive percentage of employment in the country. But as he notes, these roles often require native level Norwegian because you're, dealing with the public
Right. Yeah.
and communicating, in that context. But I think it's also good for people to understand, and this is corroborated in our other sources, like Norway has this growing tech sector,
Right.
which, they need software developers, they need cloud architects, they need data scientists. So, depending on what your background is and what your skills are, different industries will have different, different levels of demand.
Right. So definitely good to do your research,
Yeah.
like break down that like job market by industry
Right.
and see where you fit into that. And he had some interesting things to say about the recruitment industry,
Hmm.
specifically in Norway.
Yeah, yeah. So this is he was comparing this to his experience in places like the UK where, there's just a lot of recruitment agencies and headhunters.
Right.
And he said that, for these white collar roles that he was looking for, it was just a lot less proactive of an approach from recruitment companies in Norway.
Interesting. So maybe they're mostly focused on like the really senior level people.
Yeah, yeah. It seems like they're like more focused on these like, executive positions where they're going to make a bigger commission.
Right. Right.
But yeah, for people who are trying to find, just a regular professional role, it might be less than what you would see in other
Right.
countries.
So it sounds like you have to be a lot more self-reliant.
Yeah.
In Norway, don't expect, your LinkedIn to be blowing up with messages from recruiters.
Right, exactly. So, given all this, it's not that surprising that like a lot of foreigners who move to Norway, to try to find, work, find themselves needing to take whatever they can get,
Right.
just to survive financially while they're looking for like the job in their field.
Right.
And that was his experience. He talks about taking like gig economy jobs. He was moving offices and things like that just to be able to pay rent.
Yeah. It's really that harsh reality, like when you go to a new country
Yeah.
and you have to just like support yourself,
Yeah.
before you get like your dream job, you got to do what you got to do.
Exactly,
Right.
exactly. And you also have to just remember that like this job market, it's very competitive,
Right.
for these white collar roles. He often got those like standard rejection emails
Yeah.
that are like, we've received hundreds of applications.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
you really are competing with a lot of other people. And then of course there's like the bigger factors, right? Like the overall economic conditions and like things like AI,
Yeah.
which are, going to change the types of jobs that are available
Right.
and what skills are needed.
So in this environment, like it makes continuous skill development even more important,
Right.
to stay ahead of the game.
Right. And I think, the author really recognized this and he talked about how he would even like, during periods of unemployment, he would use that time to learn new skills.
Okay.
He specifically talked about pursuing the CFA program and learning Python,
Right.
which are, obviously really valuable. Yeah.
In finance and data analysis. So it really is about taking that personal responsibility to, to keep yourself relevant.
Yeah, exactly. And keep learning,
Yeah.
Especially if like the skills that you had aren't really in demand right now. Like what's the next thing? How do you keep making yourself, valuable in this marketplace? And he had this interesting thought about like Oslo itself,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Being the capital and the economic hub. Like how international did it actually feel?
Yeah. So he actually said that he had this like kind of romanticized view in his head of how international the workforce would be,
Yeah.
being in a major European capital.
Right.
But based on his experience, especially compared to London, which is where he had worked before,
Yeah.
it was actually quite Norwegian.
Wow.
Like a lot of Norwegians working in a lot of different sectors at different levels.
Okay.
And he had some theories about why this is.
Okay.
He mentioned like Norway's labor laws, which are, kind of known to be quite strict.
Yeah.
And also the work-life balance, right?
Yeah,
Like
yeah.
people don't work as many hours on average in Norway.
Right.
And also like salaries are high,
Yeah.
which could make it less attractive for international companies to like, really set up shop there in a big way.
Right. Right.
So I think like for you, listener, it's just good to have realistic expectations.
Yeah.
It might not be as like globally mixed
Well, yeah.
as some other European cities.
Okay.
So we all know that Norway is famous for its, benefits and employee-focused culture.
Mm-hmm.
But he had some interesting things to say about like managing your expectations about this stuff,
Okay.
especially if you're relatively new to the Norwegian job market.
Right.
So one thing he pointed out is that part-time contracts are actually really common in some sectors,
Okay.
especially like blue-collar work, which can be really tough,
Right.
in terms of like having like a stable income.
Right. And also like planning your life and budgeting and all that. Exactly. Yeah. He also said that, employer contributions to pensions might be lower than what he was used to.
Yeah.
And also he found that like training opportunities, specifically targeted at like immigrant workers just weren't that available, at
Yeah.
least in his experience. So, for you, I think the takeaway here is, do your research, understand that like things might be different
Yeah.
than they are in your home country. So, okay, given all of this stuff, it makes sense that at some point he really started to reevaluate his decision,
Yeah.
about moving there for work.
Right.
And this was great advice that he had. He said, really think about the trade-offs.
Yeah.
Like, yes, Norway has amazing nature
Yeah.
and it's really safe, but you need to weigh that against the possibility that, like, your career is going to stagnate,
Right.
or that it's just going to be really, really difficult to find a good job,
Yeah.
depending on your field.
Right. Right.
So he said, unless you're moving for like really strong personal reasons like family,
Right.
you really need to assess your career prospects there compared to like where you are now.
Yeah, absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. Like what are you actually giving up? What are the costs and benefits here?
Oh,
You know?
yeah.
So he had this interesting point. He said that sometimes when he was rejected from jobs,
Yeah.
he got this feedback that he was overqualified.
Yeah.
And he's like, what does that even mean?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's very demotivating. It almost feels like a polite way of saying something else.
Right.
Like what's the real reason?
Yeah, exactly. So his takeaway was that, like, it's best to just be totally honest about your qualifications.
Yeah.
Rather than trying to downplay them.
Yeah, right.
Because, you probably don't actually want that job if you're overqualified.
Yeah, exactly. And given like all this like this tough journey that he had
Yeah.
this good piece of advice, which is like you got to have an exit strategy. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if it's not working, it's not working.
Yeah.
And there's no shame in that.
Right.
So, particularly for those who, might be EU citizens and have like, more mobility and don't necessarily have strong ties to Norway.
Right.
He's saying, think about your long-term goals.
Yeah.
Are you going to achieve those in Norway? Or is it time to move on?
Right.
Yeah, really, really good points there.
Yeah. And despite all this, despite all of the frustrations and the setbacks, he does like ultimately frame it as this like, valuable life experience.
Right.
Even if he didn't get that job, he learned a lot. He grew as a person.
Yeah.
He tried to build a life in a new country.
Yeah. Which is an achievement in itself.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, I thought this was really important to mention. He talked about self-care.
Right. Yeah.
This job searching process, it's tough.
It is emotionally draining.
Yeah.
It's hard on your well-being.
Yeah, I guess.
You're getting rejected all the time.
Right.
It's hard on the ego. It's hard on the just emotionally.
Yeah. And he makes the point, this is his experience, right?
Yeah.
Other people might have very different, journeys.
Right.
So to get some additional perspective here, I want to look at this online forum,
Yeah.
That followed the publication of his article. Like, were these experiences unique to him, or is this like a bigger trend?
Right. Yeah.
So, what were some of the key things that emerged from that?
So the forum was really good. A lot of what he had said was echoed by others who had either gone through the same thing or were going through it currently.
Right.
And one commenter who actually had managed to find, this white-collar work, he said, look, having Norwegian friends who were willing to vouch for me, like within their network,
Right.
was absolute critical.
Yeah.
Like really reinforcing that, like, yeah, personal connections are so key.
Yeah.
Even if they're not like, strictly professional.
Right.
A lot of commenters also like, yeah, they said the same thing about the language.
Yeah.
Like B1, B2 is not enough. Like you got to go beyond that. And one suggestion, which I thought was really interesting, was that like maybe there's more success if you go to like the rural areas.
Okay.
Like outside the big cities where it's less competitive.
Right.
And maybe like a stronger community network might help you get in.
Okay.
with those personal connections.
So it's almost like the opposite of what you would think.
Right. Yeah, go where the people are less.
Right.
Rather than everyone flocking to the main centers.
Yeah. The value of certified vocational training, this fagbrev in Norwegian,
Right.
was really highlighted as a pathway for some people, which makes sense. I mean, this is something that's highly valued in Norway. It's like basically a professional license, right?
Right. Yeah.
But, that shows that you have a specific level of competence. So, if that's your background, that's something to consider. And, the forum also generally confirmed like the slowness of the hiring process.
Yeah.
And the importance of networking. We
Right.
talked about that a lot. And then this was interesting. There was this like discussion about the importance of tailoring your applications to each specific role.
Right.
And then there was this like debate, I guess, a little bit sensitive about like the impact of having a foreign sounding name.
Yeah, right, right. It's always a tricky one.
Yeah, yeah.
But I mean, yeah, it could be a subtle, like, unconscious bias that's happening there
Yeah.
that some people might perceive.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, hard to know. Hard to know for sure.
Yeah. The advice was like always apply in Norwegian.
Yeah.
Unless they specifically say English is okay.
Right.
And of course, the visa issue came up a lot.
Right. Which, for people who aren't from EU or EEA countries, that's a huge hurdle.
Yeah.
This was a really good tip. They said, check out jobnorge.no. So this is for government jobs. And apparently, the language requirements might be a little bit less strict in some roles.
That's
And then
right.
finally, someone said, check out these international NGOs because they may have less strict Norwegian language requirements.
Yeah. Expert speaker.